This is the World Organic News for the week ending 4th of February 2019. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. This week we begin with some good news out of Senegal. From the site News Ghana comes the piece entitled President Sall announces that Senegal will adopt agroecology. Quote, the chairman of Enda Tiers Monde International Network, Mariam Sow, is delighted. The call that civil society organisations have made since the 1970s has finally been heard. The appropriation of the principles of agroecological transition have been their workhorse for decades. This emblematic figure of clean agriculture salutes the awareness of the authorities to move towards a model of agricultural production that does not degrade our forests or soil and that does not pollute our groundwater or surface water. Indeed, in his message to the nation on December 31, 2018, President Macky Sall announced the preparation of Senegal's Sahelian country to the ecological transition through the PSE Vert, end quote. Reading further into the article, and I will encourage you all to check this source, link in the show notes, the underlying problems in Senegal sound very much like the underlying problems wherever industrial agriculture has come to town. Polluted water, polluted soils, falling soil fertility and deforestation. As in many places, the voices calling the while for a better system have their roots back in the 1970s. Enda Tiers Monde is one such organisation. There's a link in the show notes. The site is in French, and Google Translate seems to have some difficulty translating, but if your French is up to the job, have a look. Mine is far from the job. From the piece again, quote, in fact, agroecology borrows a lot from agricultural techniques known in Africa. That's why, since the 1970s, Enda Tiers Monde campaigns for the popularisation of agroecology. Experts believe that the sustainability of the agricultural production system depends to a large extent on this, in inverted commas, alternative. The agroecological transition is to bring back to life the land, our forests, the microorganisms that are in the soil. On the basis of pesticide residue analysis in the soil, Endapronat has initiated farmers' organisations to use other cultivation techniques, says So, who praises the President's vision of a republic to make the agroecological transition a strategic access of the PSE. It's about to bring back to life the land, our forests, the microorganisms that are in the ground, end quote. This return to older ways is a theme, in the same way that John Seymour's complete book of self-sufficiency was a look back to the high farming tradition of the British Isles. I suspect much of the techniques promoted by Enda Tiers Monde are in the same mould, but from an African standpoint. The problem we face is that these older methods are a step back along the evolution of farming that led to the industrial system we are suffering under today. With the popularity of the Green Revolution, in inverted commas, of the 1960s, many of the best and brightest in the agricultural field drank the Kool-Aid and went into developing this form of agriculture. But we do have counter-examples. Seymour, of course, but also Jevons, Fukuoka and Mollison. There's links to all of those gentlemen in the show notes. Aside from their interest in organic techniques, the other things they all have in common is facial hair, but I digress. These individuals, the organisations they created, and Enda Tiers Monde, have for decades been preaching to the converted. It is only as the realities of both industrial agriculture and its carbon effects become so obvious that the lobbying efforts of the corporations supporting industrial ag have faced real competition that the mainstream is starting to see another way. I recall, I think, from an hour-long film on permaculture featuring Bill Mollison, entitled In Grave Danger of Falling Food, link in the show notes, Bill's comment along the lines that stopping the destruction of old-growth forests was important, but more important was the rehabilitation of already damaged ecosystems. He was pleased to see so many then young people doing the work, unheralded, that he thought the future was in good hands. We are at a crossroads. Probably we are beyond the crossroads and need to map our way back to the other paths we could have taken. The work of Enda Tiers Monde in French-speaking Africa, the outreach of the Fukuoka, Seymour, Jevons and Mollison created organisations are also making a difference. An old model, but one that has many adherents, especially it seems in the wine growing sector, is biodynamics. This too is based upon keeping soil healthy, and most things will look after themselves. In episode 117 of this podcast, we covered this system with Mark Rathbone from Save Our Soils. Links to all of these in the show notes, where he explained how he uses the system to rehabilitate pasture by growing vegetables on a rotational basis. With biodynamics, and because of whom the founder was, Rudolf Steiner, there can be some esoteric matters that do not sit well with some people. Mark's site, the Save Our Soils, and as he discussed during episode 117, is focused upon the rigorously tested evidence-based techniques that come out of biodynamics, so do not be put off by the esoteric. After all, much of Isaac Newton's life was spent in alchemy, trying to find the philosopher's stone. What we find useful nowadays is his work on gravity and calculus. Take what works and leave the rest seems like a plan. For a final word, I'll go back to the original post. Quote, "The success of ecological transition depends on managing the management of our land assets, and we must accept that this resource is used to satisfy both the agricultural needs and the restoration of vegetation cover. We must also control the governance of our water resources. We cannot grant land to multinationals that are agro-businesses, using all kinds of chemical inputs and claiming to arrive at the agroecological transition." End quote. Wise advice. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. A podcasting checklist is still available over at the website. There's a link in the show notes, and a transcript of this episode will be available on the blog. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.